Good evening. Hope all of you all safe and please maintain physical distancing. Use mask whenever you go out. Use sanitizer as many times as possible. Be safe and stay healthy. Upgrade yourself as much as possible during the lockdown period through webinars like this. Welcome to the fourth day of our webinar lecture series. On behalf of our chairman, Sri Krishna Pokle, our principal, Dr. D.B. Arolkar, and my departmental colleagues, I welcome you all to listen to our resource person, Dr. Paromita Chakrabarti. A special welcome to Ma'am Paromita. Diaspora is the term used to describe dispersion of people from their original homeland has become an increasingly pertinent topic of discussion in the contemporary society. If you look back in history, there is a reference in the Bible about diaspora of Jews who exiled from Israel by the Babylonians in the 6th century. There are two types of dispersal of people, compulsory dispersal and voluntary. The books are written on both perspectives. Do you all know that India has the largest diaspora in the world with around 18 millions of its citizens living in other countries? We have plenty of Indian diaspora writers like V.S. Naipaul, Salman Rushdie, Amitav Ghosh, Zumpa Lahiri, Rohinton Mistry, Bharati Mukherjee, Meena Alexander, Kamala Markandeya, Anita Desai, Hari Kunjru, and the list is endless. These writers' major concern was about a strong sense of belonging to the homeland, dislocation, displacement, a feeling of loss, alienation, cultural identity, ethnicity, their experiences in the settled land, relationship with the ancestral roots, panic, nausea, madness about native culture, cultural clashes, quest for identity, and so on. One example I can tell is about Mira Sail's novel Anita and Me. It is partly an autobiographical novel which brings out the mental turmoil of an immigrant who struggles between two cultures and the conflict in the mind of the protagonist whether to follow the Indian or the British culture. If you take the partition literature, most of the writers talk about the unfortunate people who passed through the trauma of the partition. The writers dealt with tragic stories by exploring the human destiny. Partition literature mainly deals with hooliganism, treachery, rape, murder, abduction, thirst of blood among people, the tragic story of an individual by exploring the human destiny, the traumatic experiences of the partition, which had made the writers to expose the human nature and its capability of perpetrating cruelty and barbarism on its own read. If you take Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan, which shows the repercussions of partition and the breakdown of the mankind, he does not talk much about actual partition, but about the displacement and sufferings of the humankind. Amitav Ghosh's novel, The Shadow Lines, brings out the sufferings of the victims due to partition. Let us listen to our resource person of today's webinar session, Dr. Paromita Chakrabarti, who is going to connect partition literature and diaspora writing. Her topic for today is violent belongings, conflict, crisis, and culture in post-partition writings from South Asian diaspora. I'm happy to introduce the resource person, Dr. Paromita Chakrabarti, who is Associate Professor in English and Director, Global Research Initiatives, that is GRI, at HR College of Commerce and Economics, University of Mumbai, where she has been teaching since 2001. She is a 2010-11 Fulbright Nehru Doctoral Research Fellow at the Department of English, Indiana University, Bloomington. Her research areas include migration, diaspora writing, post-colonial studies, gender and nation. She has published several articles in international journals and is the assistant editor of the peer-reviewed journal Writing Today, International Journal of Studies in English. She has been a joint editor for the peer-reviewed journal Baltic Worlds from Soderton University, Stockholm, and has reviewed many other journals. She has been a resource person at UGC refresher courses. She annually teaches a master's level seminar classes on feminist critical theory at the University of Sheffield and has been an invited speaker for seminar lectures at several universities and colleges both in India and abroad. I feel so happy to introduce Dr. Paromita Chakrabarti. Paromita, please take over.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shanti. I hope I am audible.
Yes.
Yes, thank you for this invite. And these are difficult times that we are living in. And at a time like this, when people are walking, miles and miles to reach home, I am hauntingly reminded of the partition of India in 1947. We have seen those images come back and bring us back the trauma of having to leave home. And in this case, today's world, we see the trauma of trying to even reach home. So I think it's very pertinent we talk about the idea of belongings. And my talk today is about the very politics of belonging in a time which is fraught with violence, fraught with displacement, and what we see is a lot of painful journeys that people are making today, either to reach home or to even, reach a safe haven. So I'd like to begin with a few quotes, and I'd like to share my PPT for students who want to, or participants who actually want to see. Let's begin with a few quotes here. What we see is three very important quotes that talk about violence and nation. The naked passion of the self-love of nations in its drunken delirium of greed is dancing to the clash of steel and howling verses of vengeance. The hungry self of the nation shall burst in a violence of fury from its shameless feeding, for it has made the world its food. A very pertinent quote from Rabindranath Tagore, an equally important quote from Mahatma Gandhi. What difference does it make to the dead, the orphans, and the homeless, whether the mad destruction is wrought under the name of totalitarianism or the holy name of liberty and democracy? And finally, Walter Benjamin's the task of a critique of violence may be summarized as that of expounding its relation to law and justice. What I'm trying to say is that when we are talking about belongings, we also need to understand, how do we belong? Do we belong because we are born in a nation, or do we belong because we have been given the right to belong by another body, an authority which tells us that you have a right to belong? Is belonging always mediated? Is belonging always about identities? Or can we belong just because we want to? So these are the questions I want to raise in this talk. And I also want to kind of remember that when we are talking about belonging and violence, we also have to remember that there is something that we always subsume under this idea of belonging, which is justice. Who belongs in what ways? How do we belong? And what is the ethical moral universe of such a belonging? These are the questions I want to pose in today's talk. We cannot begin talking about belonging in post-partition writings without looking at traumatic events that have defined our nation, such as the 1947 partition, where people crossed the Radcliffe line, and what we saw was images of these haunting images of refugees filling up trains and just crossing borders. We also saw the single largest episode of uprooting of people in modern history. The 1947 partition of India, it resulted in an estimated death of 1.5 million people and the displacement of 12 to 14 million people over the course of 4 years, with exodus continuing well into the 50s. 1.14 million crossed the Radcliffe line in 1 year as refugees. Partition continues to haunt popular consciousness and memory. It makes its presence felt in cultural texts, and the reverberations of such a momentous event continue to mark our engagement with the past and the present. The traumatic memory of partition continues to trouble our understanding of nation, belonging, and citizenship. Partition shapes our understanding of present-day violence, displacement, migration, and post-colonial nationalism. Well, these are not easy images to see. We are seeing such images even today when people are dying on the streets because of hunger. And here we have an image from partition. The estimates of how many people died vary immensely, but partition scholars have put it in the range between 500,000 to 1.5 million. And most of the dead, of course, like people who die on the streets in times like this, are undistinguished, anonymous, and they are a collectivity, so we don't know their names. Well, before we begin with writings from South Asian diaspora, which are reflective of this kind of continuum from partition to post-partition, I want to assert that the Indian subcontinent has been a witness to a series of bloodletting from the first partition of the Indian subcontinent in 1947, followed by the second in 1971. And thereafter, by way of several implosive autochthonous movements for autonomy and self-determination. In this talk, I want to foreground the continuities and discontinuities between the historical documentation of violence, dislocation, and crisis of belonging in the subcontinent in times of post-partition conflict, and the representations of such in the cultural imaginary, with particular reference to literary texts from the space of the South Asian diaspora. Now, this talk will focus on three specific ideological critique of conflict in South Asia from late 1960s till date. So the first discussion would be on the second partition of the subcontinent in 1971, with the fracture of East Pakistan from West Pakistan and the creation of Bangladesh. The second movement that I want to talk about is the autochthonous movement of Gorkhaland in Darjeeling district and diverse areas of West Bengal from 1986 onwards. I do this because I want to talk about the crisis. So if the first text, which where I will talk about Bangladesh, the formation of Bangladesh and the violence of that formation, is to talk about a conflict, the Gorkhaland issue, and the crisis that we see in Darjeeling district with the autochthonous movement, is to look at the idea of post-colonial crisis. Finally, we come to the questions of insurgency in Kashmir post 1989, where I want to use culture and see how cultural identities are mediated in this extremely conflictual space of Kashmir. So these are the texts I'm going to look at. The first one is the Pakistani American author Seraya Khan's debut novel Noor, which I will look at in terms of conflict and the formation of the nation of Bangladesh. The second text I want to look at is in the context of crisis, post-colonial crisis and modernity. I'll look at Kiran Desai's Booker Prize-winning novel, The Inheritance of Loss. And finally, I will look at the very idea of a cultural identity in mediating violence through the poems of Agha Shahid Ali, the Kashmiri American diasporic poet. Now, we begin with the concept of diaspora in the nation. We will look at how nations are formed, both in terms of diaspora and migration, as well as when boundaries and borders change. So we look at population exchange and population assignment, which is linked to the project of nationality and citizenship. We will look at women and poor subjects as most vulnerable to uprooting and displacement. We'll also look at the enduring legacy of human rights, even in the face of extreme violence and terror. And when we are talking about these fraught, themes of displacement and horror, we have to understand how does literature play a role in mitigating the kind of violence we are seeing around us, and what is the role of transnational migration in this context. Now, we know that transnational migration has been one of the most important human experiences of contemporary times. Movement, displacement, exodus, and exile have been and is one of our most urgent humanitarian and political crises. This crisis has to do with stateless people, refugees, asylum seekers, forced migrants, and massive exodus of groups fleeing war, destitution, famine, poverty, ethnic conflict, and political violence. Literature provides us with the conceptual tools to fully comprehend the extent of loss that migration involves and the trauma of displacement that has accompanied every partition and every violent conflict that the subcontinent has witnessed or continues to witness. The literary critiques provide us a way in which we can understand this displacement. I mean, the horrors of disciplinary nationalism, which insists that people have to belong in an appropriate way to a fixed place that is identifiable in a definite way on the map of the world, is fiercely contested in the works of many diaspora writers. The texts and the works that I'm going to look at today clearly resist the idea of any single home for which one longs or to which one can belong, furthering instead the idea of many transitions, multiple journeys, and continuous straddling of several times, spaces, and language. Now, these writers that I'm looking at critique the idea of a linear diaspora narrative that begins with exile and ends with a nostalgia-fueled return. These writers are conscious of the fractious nature of leaving and an equally complex habitation in the metropole. Writers embody the idea of a homing desire rather than desiring an ultimate, absolute, final return to the country of their origin. So, home and belonging in a violent, fractured world constitute the arc of their writings and provide the bulwark for their post colonial imaginings. They show how identities are formed in the liminal spaces between cultures, ethnicities, and nations, through most often than not violent intermixing, commingling, and colliding. Right, now we come to the very first text that I want to grapple with. How do we memorialize the gender story? Where are the women in this story of displacement, of partitions? We look at, ways in which we can find what women went through in terms of the conflict, violence that was wrought on their bodies. We have literature, memoirs, letters, documentaries, films, theater, painting, photography, music, television, all of which forms cultural texts through which we can access history that has been written out of history. That is the women's history. We look at the women question, both in 1947 and in 1971. I mean, the violence of identity that we saw writ large on women's bodies is what I am going to talk about in a few minutes. But before that, we need to understand that there were many kinds of violence wrought on women's bodies. I mean, there was personal revenge in the background of communal, cultural, collective, civil, and political violence. Men's wars were fought on women's bodies. Women were seen as markers of the community, as boundaries of dispute, as symbols of purity, as embodiments of honor, tradition, nation, culture. They were the nurturers of a national culture, reproducers of the nation. Rape becomes one of the most heinous ways in which, and weaponized in the war to shame, defile, infiltrate, and emasculate the enemy. And rape was used as a weapon of war, as a military strategy that we will talk about in a short while. But I want to leave you with the idea of how bodies became a site of spectacular violence, and how bodies also became a site of containment. So to move on to the women question, the most important question that we need to ask is, where are the women in the history of partition? What happened to them during the conflict? How did they experience partition? What kind of violence happened? Well, how do we know their stories, and who will tell us and how? In Partition Riots of 1947, According to Urvashi Butalia, 75,000 women were raped, abducted, and killed on both sides of the border. In 1971, when the second partition of the subcontinent happened, more than 200,000 women were held in rape camps and were detained for 2.5 months by the West Pakistani army. And here we come to the story of Soraya Khan. Her debut novel, Noor, written in 2004, talks about women, war, and rape. It interrogates official history. It addresses collective memory and traumatic past events. It breaks the wall of silence around gender violence. And very interestingly, it demands accountability and responsibility from the perpetrators, the West Pakistani army soldiers here. And it is a call for rehabilitation and healing for victims. The story centers around 4 generations of the Ali family in Islamabad, Pakistan. But before we go to the story, we need to know very important things about this particular novel. It is one of the very first novels to break the silence that surrounds the history of the Liberation War of 1971. The novel exposes the brutality of war and shows how violence irredeemably impacts and transforms both violator and the violated. Noor breaks the silences around the errors of history that was committed in order to sanitize processes of nation building and reconstruction of citizenship neatly along religious and ethnic lines in Pakistan. Writing memory into history, Khan posits a counter discourse that challenges the way the nation state chose to remember 1971, the tumultuous year of the war that broke up Pakistan and gave birth to an independent nation, Bangladesh. This novel is written from the perspective of the perpetrator. It is a novel that has come out of diaspora space, talking about the atrocities that were committed on women, Bengali women, during the Liberation War. Difficult book to write, difficult story to grapple with, but nevertheless so important for not just people who want to come to terms with violence, but also for people who want to understand how nations are made or unmade. We have this novel where Ali is the WPA war veteran who comes back from Dhaka after the war, and he returns with a 5 and 6 year old Sajida to his mother Nani Jan. He picks up this girl from a road in Dhaka and makes her his daughter. Sajida and Hussein. Sajida marries her sweetheart Hussein, and they have 2 sons and a daughter, Noor. It is through the character of Noor and her paintings that the memory of 1971 is uncovered and the history of the second partition of the subcontinent unmade. I want to concentrate, when I'm talking about Noor, only on one specific aspect, the aspect of violence, the aspect of physical violence, the aspect of rape as military strategy. And what you see here is, by writing about the rape of Bengali women by the West Pakistani army, Soraya Khan attempts to break the narrative of silence and unearth the buried memories in order to make it possible for the nation and its citizens to make peace with themselves and with others. Khan is completely aware that silence and forgetting is one way of dealing with the trauma of the past. But as she says in her website, she was more interested in engaging with what can be remembered, what is allowed to be discussed, and what needs to be forgotten at a social and political level. So here you have a novel which talks about the strategic violence that was practiced on Bengali women who were abducted or apprehended by the soldiers and taken to the military barracks to be repeatedly raped. There were rape camps that were instituted at that point in time, and there is evidence of it. But the story of Noor acts as a testament to the wartime crime that WPA was guilty of and till date has not been held accountable for. Although interestingly, when General Pervez Musharraf visited Bangladesh, the first time an official apology was tendered on behalf of Pakistan for the calamitous events that occurred during 1971 liberation war, hoping that the wounds of war will have healed or will heal with time. I have what I've done is I've picked up a little article from the Guardian, and interested participants can go and have a look at this film, which talks about these Virangana women, these women who were later termed as heroines of the liberation war. What has happened to them in Bangladesh, and how did they deal with the aftermath of that kind of violence on them? What was their life like? So I think it's a very important film that one needs to watch, and it's available on YouTube. So if you are interested, please go and have a look at it. But I want to end, Noor, by talking about rape as a weapon of war. The rape of women needs to be looked from both dimensions of sex and violence, instead of focusing, as the evolutionary theory of rape does, solely on sex or early feminist positions as primarily about patriarchal domination. Wartime rape is much more than that. It's not just about libidinous male soldiers releasing their pent up sexual energy, as was determined in the comfort women case in World War II, or simply about misogynistic men conditioned by patriarchy to dominate, distrust, and despise women, or the brutal militarization of any society, pathological culture that encourages rapacious behavior. No, rape was used as a weapon of war to make women unproductive, to ensure that they do not reproduce for the enemy community, or to defile their bodies with enemy blood. So this is how nations were made, and this is how nations were unmade. And what is most important is we understand the organization and structure behind this violence. It is not natural. It is not ordinary. These are spectacular, sites of violence, and one has to deal with them in order to understand how can we bring justice. How can we do justice to women who had to go through this kind of brutal violence on their bodies. Well, after that, I think it's important that we also go beyond any kind of simple biological determination or ideologically driven imperatives to understand that women are going to be, women and children and poor people are going to be the first victims of any conflict. And we know that in order to emasculate the enemy, the first place or the first site of violence would be the women of that community. Now let's look at the strategic dimensions that would necessitate the involvement of the state in order to make sure that institutional initiatives in order to alleviate suffering and resolve conflict and claims are put in place. So we have to make the state culpable and accountable for any kind of violence that happens on women during political conflict. Moving on to Kiran Desai, I want to now look at her novel, The Inheritance of Loss, where I want to determine the extent of crisis that we are facing today as a post-colonial nation, as well as the crisis of modernity that encompasses the entire world, particularly the global north. So, set in the early days, the demand for Gorkha land in the sub-Himalayan region of West Bengal, this novel is set in Kalimpong, moves between India and USA. She uses parallel narration to bind the apparently disparate characters in order to engage with the politics of globalization, and also to represent the failure of post-colonialism to deliver people from impotency and poverty, really. Why does she use parallel narration? She uses it because she wants to talk about several characters and show how they are connected in this post-colonial space. You have primarily, you see, she charts out three characters. She has Sai, she has Biju, and she has Jemubai Patel. Well-edged characters. Sai is the orphan 17-year-old girl living with her grandfather Jemubai, Cambridge educated Anglophile, retired judge. And you have Biju's story, the 19-year-old son of the cook Pannalal, who travels to USA as an illegal immigrant. I mean, these are characters that represent the utter failure of post-colonial nation state, as well as the utter failure or the false promise of globalization. We move on to talk about empire, post-colony, and migrants. So I'm going to look at empire. So I'm going to look at the fault lines of colonial modernity project, and through Jimupai's character that's very well etched out. These characters are products of an earlier structure of power that had its origins in empire and became post-empire flag bearers of a wasted modernity. You have characters who are unwilling to embrace their own culture and are absolutely unable to assimilate completely into a British way of life. So they're unhinged and pathetically alienated from their own people. And for Jemubai, the character of Jemubai, this fracture becomes pathological. He's angry at everything that reminds him of his nativeness. And he teaches himself to hate and communicate with his own people only in a language of violence. And from there, we move to migrants. The novel also deals with this entire class of migrants who are totally invisible in the diaspora space. We look at diaspora, we see successful people in the diaspora, we have writings coming out of the diaspora which talk about people having made it, the middle class, people with certain relative amount of success in a foreign country. But here you see a different diaspora. You see the shadow class. What you see here is the cruel underbelly of the diaspora in the global north. And the numerous faceless shadow class of illegal, migrants working in the bowels of the metropole. They're trying to eke out a living in the face of terrible exploitation, drudgery, racism. These characters become visible in the novel. Interestingly, they are called shadow class because they're anonymous. They're like the veritable shadow who's there but not there. So there's a real sense of exile in these illegal migrants. They've just got one-way ticket with no easy return. We don't know when they will be able to return. So what we see here is a diaspora of despair. The novel takes a hard look at the antebellum diaspora, filled with illegal immigrants, temporary visa holders, stowaways, hidden within the larger narrative of spectacular journeys and mythical success stories that frame a large number of distinctive diasporic experiences. Desai's attempt to historicize and contemporize other diasporas that comes to be situated by the global flow of illegal labor opens up spaces for contestation that naive celebrations of border crossings most definitely overlook or undermine. Differentiating diasporas and acknowledging their heterogeneity forces our attention on these questions. Why are diasporas so disparate? Why does the same diaspora fail to claim a collective we? Who is empowered and who is not in the diaspora? So what we see is national borders get trampled and are rendered irrelevant when it comes to capital flows. Money flows very easily across borders. But people's movements across it are extraordinarily, policed. And there's considerable violence and vigilance on people moving. So the shadow class is especially subject to severe scrutiny, but also like the incorporeal shadow, manages to escape the clutches of regulating authority. Disappearing and surfacing. The life of an illegal, on-the-run immigrant clearly shows how migrant laborers in diaspora are not only disposable commodities, but also unable to forge any kind of sustainable human connection. Although there are a lot of Indians in the US, the class divide that segregates Indian society circumscribes inter-class interactions. So what you have is a character like Biju, who is othered by members of his own diaspora, who set themselves apart by virtue of their class, education, and access to the majority culture from the underclass and the undocumented. Therefore, Biju is unable to understand the cultural register of adaptation that the economically privileged migrant community practices in order to make a smooth transition. This inability to communicate across class lines within the diaspora leaves Biju with a sense of betrayal and bitterness. Eventually, Biju pushes against the economic lure that defined and determined his life in New York and effects a change of status by getting on an airplane to claim his life back. Biju's rejection of diasporic status signifies a resistance that is not political, but suggestive of an oppositional consciousness. I want to end, before I move on to Aga Shahid Ali, I want to end with this idea of homecoming. Although Desai celebrates the autonomy that Biju exercises, the decisiveness that he exhibits, she's quick to deflate the sense of exhilaration that accompanies such moments of radical alterity. In mapping his tragicomic journey to Kalimpong from Siliguri, Desai makes it clear that incorporation to native ethno-national space is equally fraught and violently contested. The economic exploitation and social exclusion that Biju experiences in New York mutates into political violence and armed rebellion in his own home country. In both places, Biju is marked as an other. And in both places, Biju marks out his resistance by passively remaining outside the circle of demand and influence. Thus, I want to end by saying that Desai's inheritance loss is a deeply critical indictment of globalization. Globalization in Desai's text becomes a lived reality, experienced through its great reserves of labor, its intricate networks of capital flows, and its cruel, if not inescapable, paradigms of inclusion and exclusion. Therefore, Biju's refusal to accept his position as transnational labor as inevitable and fixed is a challenge to the hegemony of globalization. It is an acknowledgement of alternate ways of knowing and living that break away from the relentlessness of the present economic and social arrangements. Biju's diasporic movement of arrival, return as an economic migrant troubles the homogenizing forces of globalization by occupying not a pre-modern space, but a site where meta-narratives of capitalist accumulation, cultural assimilation, and transnational mobility seems to have been evacuated of meaning. Is there a final home for anyone? I think that's what she leaves us with. Desai's novel leaves us with a sense of deep disquiet and kind of agonizing, extreme agonizing pain and dislocation. Even when there's a final scene of reconciliation, what you see is that small Himalayan town explodes with violence, ethnic strife, and devastation. It is a powerful reminder that in spite of the son's homecoming, there can be no final or absolute return. Right, now we move to Aga Shahid Ali, one of the most important poets that have come out of this broad space of Kashmir. And we look at his poetics of home and the anxieties of belonging, and we see that this is a writer who is imbued with a sense of cosmopolitanism, a writer who is able to connect the different cultural strands that is part of his identity. He is a diasporic writer who challenges the notion of a linear diaspora narrative that begins with exile and ends with a nostalgia of return. He's conscious of the fractious nature of living in an equal complex habitation in the metropole. His writings contest the idea of a stable, rooted, fixed home and instead forwards the idea of transition, of multiple locations, of simultaneous straddling of various spaces, places, and time. Most importantly, what he does is he takes his own tradition and turns it into something else. He experiments, deeply experimental, and he does it with the ghazal form, which is steeped in multicultural richness and this kind of experimentation. It also attests to its hybrid nature, to the very idea that things are flexible, things can be changed, things can be made better or maybe made more readable for a particular audience at a particular time, but keeping the essence of that original form intact, keeping the beauty of the form intact. So it is not to confuse, but to make it more clear, and that is why you have, it provides you with a strange resting clarity. It provides a challenge to both Eastern and Western culture and aesthetic practice. We also see in his writings the idea of politics of belonging and the painful longing for a home torn apart by armed conflict and political violence, but also transformed by desire and bound in love, loss, and fear. So in his writings, you have multiple spaces, multiple locations, yet you have a deep sense of longing for the lost home. So moving on to his aesthetics. In Ali's work, home is a place which is only available through absence and erasure, longing for which is circumscribed by reductive yet overarching nationalism and claims of belonging validated in the cartography of personal art. His experiments with the ghazal form is steeped in a multicultural richness that attests to its hybrid nature. And as I already said, it makes it so clear for both Western as well as Eastern audiences. Malcolm Woodland, in his article Memories of Homeland, Aga Shahid Ali and the Hybrid Ghazal, points out that Ali, on one hand, argues for the unity of the letter and spirit in the authentic tradition of the Ghazal, yet liberates it from predictability and monotony by the complex interplay of form and meaning. We go to Ali's, deep nostalgia for home, love for home, longing for home, really. And he aches to be in Kashmir. And all his first full-length collections, three of his first full-length collections, the Half-Inch Himalayas, a nostalgist's map of America, and the country without a post office, are about displacement and longing. These poems are replete with the imagery of loss and exile, not only for the present generation, but also for the past. In a nostalgist's map of America, he talks about political upheavals, people's struggle and resistance that have resulted in massive displacements, loss of livelihood, and the destruction of habitats. Ali's poem Postcard from Kashmir, from his collection The Half-Inch Himalayas, speaks of loss, pain, and exile from home, and the acceptance that one can perhaps go back to the place, but there can be no final homecoming, as the original home is forever lost and is available now only through memory and his art. And here is the poem. Kashmir shrinks into my mailbox, my home a neat 4 by 6 inches. I always loved this neatness. Now I hold the half-inch Himalayas in my hand. So it's a postcard from Kashmir, and that's all it is. And that will be his home. That will be how close he will be to home. Because he knows when he goes back, he will not find this home as he left it. It will be like a giant negative, a bit out of focus, black and white, still undeveloped. And the Jhelum's waters, not so clean, because they have turned red. You cannot forget the unimaginable violence that such a beautiful land sees almost on a regular basis. We move on to the idea of, ancestral paternal origins in Kashmir, and to the maternal origins in Lucknow. I mean, Ali's trajectory of being born in Delhi, of having deep associations in Lucknow, his maternal side, of living in Kashmir, and then moving to the US. What you see is the poet has this idea of syncretism. It's deeply syncretic the way he's able to bring different cultures together. So the joy of being able to engage with and appreciate both ghazals and Krishna's bhajans are clear in his artistic movement. We move on to also his deep consciousness of violence, or his pain at what happened to this nation, to this place we call home, how the empire, exploited this land for resources, and what happened to this land, and what happened to people who lived in it, people who had a livelihood. So you have a poem like Dhaka Gozes, and you see here that it is a testimony of British colonialism's deep, constant exploitation for resources. That's how we became a colony. We see in this poem how Ali refers to what happened to those weavers who wove the Dhaka muslins, which were passed through the eye of a ring. And you see, he writes that in history we learned that the hands of weavers were amputated, the looms of Bengal silenced and the cotton shipped raw by the British. And in the same collection, he continues to bring to memory the destruction of homes and the tragic loss of living creatures, living cultures. He says, "In my dream, I'm always in a massacred town," alluding to the nightmare of modern living, alienation, and deathly sense of exile. He continues in the same dark strain. "I'm alone walking among atrocities, guillotines blood-scorched, gods stabbed at their altars, dry wells piled up with bones, a curfew of ghosts." Partition of India bleeds into this poem, and the sense of being uprooted begins to strike at the center, mixing up with the scenes of violence from a deserted American ghost town. The speaker is stranded, waiting alone at the town's ghost station for a train which is lost, whose tracks are rusted, a train that will take him home. The scene is an eerie reminder of the trains that ran to Pakistan from India and back, bringing dead, mutilated bodies piled on one another, while relatives on both sides waited at the stations, deeply anxious and drenched in fear of the worst. The trains had come to symbolize ghostly monsters flying dead bodies, drenched in blood and marked by unimaginable violence. Ali's poem works with the terrible and wounding memory of partition, where millions of people were displaced, uprooted, and were compelled to flee into a newborn country, leaving behind their homes and belongings. Final poem in the collection, aptly titled Houses, refers to the contingency and fragmentary nature of home itself, while pointing out the difference between an act of imagining a home and the material security of a home. You look at the poem and you see that home is lost. Home is not safe. Homes can burn. Parental home is lost in turmoil and can no longer provide comfort. The home Ali has is the one in exile. And like the man who digs and buries his home in the shifting sands, the poet too takes apart his house and makes it up again in poetry. And he ends, "My father is dead," Vidur writes, "and a house in my neighborhood next to my parents has burned down." I want to end this talk with the idea of Ali being a cosmopolitan nomad. And his nostalgia is not just a nostalgia of the past, it's a nostalgia for all things that were valuable, that were meaningful, that made us what we are and who we want to be. In a nostalgic map of America, the poet is a wanderer who is between places and roads, linking up the foreign exits with the native landscapes. At every turn on the bend of the road, Ali finds something he already knew, like his lines in the poem In Search of Evanescence. By the way, this is from, he was deeply interested in Emily Dickinson's poems, and this is a direct reference to it. "When on Route 80 in Ohio, I came across an exit to Calcutta. Temptation to write a poem led me past the exit." So I could say India always exists off the turnpikes of America. And he goes on to talk about the river Ganges and how finally the road is a river and all the cars have disappeared, polished. The road is a river, polished silver by cars. The route has disappeared. The cars are urns carrying ashes to the sea. You have a deep sense of pain, but also a strange sense of intermingling and commingling of different disparate geographic spaces, almost trying to tell us that we are citizens of the world. Our homes are not fixed. They may belong to a country, but they can be taken away anytime. They can be burned down. They can disappear like houses in the sands. So we have to make homes in the world. Therefore, here you have this sign of the cosmopolitan Aga Shahid, the nomad. And what we also see that he's a poet of desire, of longing, and of love. Moves rapidly between borders. He's a poet of the near and of the far. His poems are diasporic only in the way they center around the desire to belong and the longing to be. His work clearly signifies a break from the linear movement of the diaspora in terms of homeland and land of exile or adoption, and embraces the multiplicity of being made of many places, many histories, and many cultures. The beauty of his poems shines through the pain of longing, seared with the desire to belong. They are profound in their impossibility of return, in their tireless wanderings, in their untethered roots that lie in the desert, waiting to be lost in the yellow storm, or in the shiny cosmopolitanism of modern living in the West. Aga Shahid Ali is a poet of impossible yet necessary nostalgia, a poet whose groundwork springs from his sense of being in exile and yet ties him to the perennial condition of longing for a home in the world. I want to finish this talk by just trying to understand, why do we study literature? How can literature help us achieve a sense of being and belonging? How can it make us more sensitive? Are we able to empathize with victims of conflict through literature? Is it able to deepen our connections with those who tragically fall out of the margins of nation and citizenship? I guess it is. That is why literature holds such a great value and is so deeply meaningful to our existence. Given the implosive situation in the Indian subcontinent right now, with the Kashmir issue post the abrogation of Article 370, implementation of NRC and CAA, the continuous Gorkhaland agitation for autonomy and statehood, rise in communal atrocities in India, threat of terrorism and rising fundamentalism in Pakistan, the genocide of Rohingya Muslims, and the pouring of refugees and persecuted migrants from Myanmar to Bangladesh, and the tense situation in Sri Lanka post-civil war with regard to strained ethnic relations between Sinhalese and Tamils, along with serious environmental degradation. This talk should come as a reminder that we all find ourselves on the fault lines of ethnicity, religion, gender, caste, nationality. We can at any moment lose the ground under our feet. We can all be homeless. We are all refugees. This talk also makes it clear that people belong to places differently and in multiple ways. And citizenship and belonging are concepts that are imbued with tremendous complexity and cannot and should not be seen in any way as absolute or uncontested. Thank you.